At first glance, the neighborhood of Willow Creek seemed like a model community. The kind of place real estate brochures bragged about. Perfectly aligned houses, freshly painted mailboxes, identical hedges trimmed to regulation height. On the surface, it was peace and order. But beneath that glossy perfection was something darker. A system of control enforced by a handful of people who believed they owned more than property. They believed they owned everyone's lives. The Homeowners Association, known simply as the HOA, was the governing body of Willow Creek. It was run by a small board of residents, led by one woman who had become both feared and despised over the years. Her name was Karen Mitchell, and she was the kind of person who could turn a minor inconvenience into a federal case. She'd fine you for leaving your trash can out 15 minutes too long, threaten you over a flower bed that wasn't HOA approved, and file complaints for anything that broke her vision of community standards. To outsiders, she was just a diligent board president. To those who lived under her, she was a dictator in designer sunglasses. I didn't live in Willow Creek myself, but I knew it well. My sister and her husband had bought a home there a few years ago, a modest two-story at the end of Birch Court. They loved the quiet streets, the parks, the illusion of safety. They didn't know what kind of machine they were stepping into. My niece, Lily, was 13 that summer. Shy, creative, always sketching birds in her notebook. She spent her afternoons biking around the cul-de-sacs, staying out until the streetlights came on. For her, Willow Creek was just a neighborhood. For Karen, it was a kingdom. The first problem started small. A letter in the mailbox about unauthorized decorations. A warning notice for leaving a soccer goal in the front yard. Then came the fines, $50 for the goal, $100 for the paint color of their mailbox, $25 for a non-conforming trash bin. My sister thought it was just part of HOA life. She paid them and moved on. But Karen wasn't interested in compliance. She wanted control, and anyone who didn't fall in line became an example. As months passed, Karen's presence in their lives became constant. She'd patrol the streets in her golf cart, clipboard in hand, inspecting lawns and snapping photos. Residents said she kept a binder of violations, complete with time-stamped pictures and printouts of HOA bylaws. She'd even show up unannounced at people's doors, claiming concern for community standards. Her power trip had become obsession. Still, no one wanted to challenge her. She was relentless, and she knew the HOA bylaws like scripture. Anyone who tried to fight back found themselves buried in paperwork, fines, or public shaming at the monthly meetings. She had built a system where fear kept everyone quiet. Then came the summer incident, the one that changed everything. It was July, and temperatures had climbed past 100 degrees. The air shimmered with heat, lawns turned brittle under the sun, and most kids stayed indoors. But Lily was restless. She had a new bike, a gift from her dad, and she wanted to take it out. She stuck to the quiet side streets, where the pavement cracked, and the trees cast just enough shade to keep her moving. That's when she crossed paths with Karen. According to neighbors who later gave statements, Karen had been conducting one of her property inspections. She had parked her golf cart near the HOA clubhouse, clipboard in one hand, camera in the other. She claimed she was documenting unapproved modifications, mostly small things, like garden ornaments and solar lights. But when she saw Lily riding near one of the vacant lots, something set her off. No one knows exactly what Karen was thinking. Some said she believed Lily was trespassing. Others said she thought the child had damaged HOA property. Whatever it was, it escalated fast. There was shouting. Witnesses heard her voice echoing down the street. And then Lily's panicked cry. Moments later, the situation spiraled into something that would make every local headline. By the time my sister called me, everything had already unraveled. There was confusion, neighbors in tears, police vehicles blocking the street. Lily had been injured, not fatally, thank God, but seriously enough to change her life. Karen, meanwhile, was standing beside her golf cart, arms crossed, insisting she had done nothing wrong. Her version of events painted herself as the victim, as if enforcing the HOA's rules justified what happened. When I arrived at the scene, I wasn't there as a judge. I was there as an uncle, furious, protective, heartbroken. But within hours, that changed, because when the case reached the county docket, fate did something cruel and surreal. I was assigned to oversee the pre-trial proceedings. It's rare, almost unheard of, for a judge to handle a case involving family. Normally, it would have been reassigned. But through a clerical shuffle and timing that felt almost deliberate, it landed on my desk before I even realized it was the same incident. And by the time I did, it was too late to recuse without raising suspicion of bias. I was trapped between my duty to uphold the law and my personal need for justice. The reports painted an ugly picture. The HOA board had tried to protect Karen, issuing statements about misunderstandings and community safety protocols. But the witness accounts contradicted her version completely. Residents described her temper, her obsession with authority, her threats. There were photos, emails, even recordings from board meetings that hinted at how deep her control went. It wasn't just about one bad day. It was about years of unchecked power. And as the investigation unfolded, it became clear that what happened to Lily wasn't an accident. It was the predictable result of a system built on intimidation, a community where one person's obsession had gone unchallenged for too long. That's when I realized something. This wasn't just a case about injury or negligence. It was a test, not just for Karen or the HOA, but for me. Could justice exist in a place where power had become personal? I remember sitting in my chambers late that night, staring at the case file. The photo on the first page was of the Willow Creek clubhouse, sunlight filtering through manicured trees. It looked peaceful, but I knew better. Behind those clean lines and carefully cut lawns, there were people living in fear. And now, because no one had stopped her sooner, a child had paid the price. The next morning, the hearings began. And that's where everything truly started to unravel. When the hearings began, Willow Creek's illusion of perfection began to crumble. On paper, it was a model community. In practice, it was a carefully managed image, one that the HOA board was determined to protect at any cost. They weren't defending justice. They were defending their reputation. The board called an emergency meeting the very next day after the incident. It wasn't about Lily. It wasn't about the truth. It was about optics, the kind of public relations panic that happens when people in power suddenly realize their control might slip. The official minutes of that meeting, which would later become public record, made their intent painfully clear. Contain the story, protect the HOA brand, and distance themselves from Karen while still shielding the board's involvement in her unchecked authority. The board president, a man named Robert Lanning, had always operated quietly behind the scenes. He let Karen take the spotlight because her personality drew the fire away from everyone else. Now, that same strategy was backfiring. Neighbors were talking. Local news outlets had picked up the story. The HOA's legal counsel was advising immediate action to reduce liability. But instead of accountability, their first move was spin. They issued a public statement describing the event as a tragic misunderstanding and assured residents that the board was fully cooperating with authorities. They left out the fact that half of them had been complicit in Karen's long reign of harassment. Behind closed doors, it was chaos. Emails between board members, later subpoenaed, showed panic, blame, and desperation. One wrote, "We can't let this ruin the community's value." Another said, "If the police or county look into our complaint records, we're done." It wasn't about Lily's pain. It was about property values, image, and control. The neighborhood had become their empire, and they were terrified of losing it. Meanwhile, I had to maintain my role as an impartial judge. But every new document that crossed my desk tested my restraint. Each report painted a clearer picture of an environment shaped by paranoia and intimidation. The HOA had issued more fines in the past year than any comparable neighborhood in the county. Residents had complained repeatedly about harassment and selective enforcement. But each complaint had been dismissed internally, handled by the same people responsible for the abuse. Karen's signature was on nearly every citation. She had been operating like law enforcement without oversight, and the board had allowed it because she kept the system running. She made the neighborhood look perfect, at least on paper. As the preliminary hearings continued, evidence surfaced that suggested the HOA had actively interfered with the investigation. Security camera footage from the clubhouse had been accidentally deleted just hours after the incident. Meeting notes were missing, and residents who had witnessed what happened to Lily suddenly became hesitant to testify. Some said they were afraid of retaliation. Others simply refused to speak. In a place like Willow Creek, silence wasn't just compliance. It was survival. But not everyone stayed quiet. A small group of residents, mostly newer homeowners, began digging. They started sharing information privately. Old emails, newsletters, even photos Karen had taken of their homes. They called themselves the Creek Collective, and while they weren't official, they were organized. Their determination was relentless. They contacted local reporters, filed public record requests, and slowly, the real story began to leak. The more the truth came out, the worse it looked for the HOA. What started as a local story spread online, amplified by outrage. People were horrified by the extent of the control, the intimidation, and now the injury to a child. The HOA board tried to dismiss it all as misinformation, but the evidence spoke louder. Residents came forward one by one, telling their own stories. Fines for trivial things, threats for questioning authority, photos taken without consent. Karen wasn't just one rogue neighbor. She was a symptom of a system that rewarded obsession and punished resistance. The turning point came when an internal memo was leaked to the press. It was dated just 2 days before the incident. In it, Karen had proposed a new enforcement initiative for community safety, effectively granting HOA officers the right to intervene directly in what she called rule violations. The language was vague, but the intent was unmistakable. She wanted more power, and the board had been considering it. They never officially adopted the proposal, but the fact that it existed at all revealed how far things had gone. When the memo went public, the board panicked again. They called another emergency meeting, this time to remove Karen from her position. It was too late. The residents demanded an external investigation, and the county ethics office got involved. Suddenly, every action the board had taken for the past 2 years was under scrutiny. Finances, voting procedures, even landscaping contracts were audited. The more they dug, the more corruption surfaced. Inflated invoices, misused funds, favoritism. What had begun as a neighborhood dispute had become a full-blown scandal. From my bench, I watched it unfold like a slow-motion collapse. Each hearing revealed another layer of decay beneath the surface. Karen maintained her innocence throughout, portraying herself as a victim of social persecution. The board distanced themselves from her, pretending they had been unaware of her conduct. But every document, every witness, every statement contradicted their story. The web of lies was unraveling, thread by thread. And yet, beneath all the chaos, there was something more personal haunting me. Lily was still recovering, physically and emotionally. My sister had moved out of Willow Creek by then, unable to bear the sight of the place. She told me the silence in their old home had become unbearable. Every sound reminded her of that day. She wanted justice, but she also wanted peace, something no court ruling could truly provide. As a judge, I knew the limits of the law. I couldn't undo what had happened. I couldn't heal the wounds or erase the fear that had settled over that community. But I could ensure one thing: accountability. Not just for Karen, but for the entire system that had enabled her. The hearings eventually reached the stage of formal indictments. Karen faced charges of negligence and misconduct. The HOA board was under civil investigation for failure to regulate and for obstructing inquiry. The case that began as a single neighborhood dispute was now a headline across the state. Still, something about it didn't sit right. There were gaps in the records, missing evidence, things that didn't add up. It felt orchestrated, like someone, somewhere, was still trying to pull the strings. Karen may have been the face of the HOA's tyranny, but I was starting to believe she hadn't been acting alone. The deeper I looked, the clearer it became that her control had been cultivated by someone with more to gain. And that realization changed everything, because it meant the story wasn't over. Not by a long shot. As the investigations deepened, the image of Willow Creek as a wholesome, tightly knit community fully collapsed. What had once been marketed as a haven of order now stood exposed as a labyrinth of control, corruption, and hidden influence. Each document I reviewed pulled another brick from the facade, and soon it became clear that Karen Mitchell hadn't built that system alone. She had been empowered, protected, and used, part of a network that had turned the HOA into a money-making machine under the guise of neighborhood management. At first, the signs were subtle. The HOA's financial statements had always appeared clean, with budgets balanced and annual dues accounted for. But during the ethics audit, discrepancies began to surface. Small amounts at first, hidden among landscaping contracts and maintenance fees. Then came irregularities too large to ignore, inflated invoices, repeated vendor payments for the same services, and large transfers to a private account under a name that didn't match any registered board member. The account was listed under Lanning Property Services, a company owned by none other than the HOA president, Robert Lanning. He had quietly set up his business to handle community upkeep, then awarded his own firm the contracts. For years, he'd been funneling association money to himself, masked by layers of documentation that looked legitimate to anyone who didn't look too closely. Karen, it seemed, had been his enforcer. While she harassed homeowners over minor infractions, Lanning used her to keep residents distracted, too busy fighting fines and citations to question where their dues were going. Every letter she sent, every rule she enforced, created fear. And fear made compliance easy. Residents thought Karen was the problem. But she was only the visible one. The real rot lived higher. Once this connection came to light, everything changed. Lanning immediately denied involvement, claiming the payments were routine vendor reimbursements. But investigators found more. Dozens of invoices traced back to shell companies owned by his relatives and close associates. The HOA had effectively become his personal business. Every homeowner, unknowingly, his client. And the longer Karen kept them under control, the longer the scheme survived. The revelations spread like wildfire. The Creek Collective, those few residents who had been gathering evidence, published what they found online. Screenshots, financial statements, board minutes, all laid out in meticulous detail. The posts went viral. What had begun as a local controversy now exploded into national attention. People from across the country started sharing their own HOA horror stories, and Willow Creek became the prime example of everything wrong with homeowners associations. Lanning panicked. Within a week, he resigned from the board, citing health reasons. Karen's attorney released a statement blaming systemic failures in HOA oversight. The remaining board members scrambled to contain the damage, calling emergency meetings and hiring new legal counsel, but the residents were done. They petitioned for the HOA's dissolution, something rarely done and legally complex. They didn't care. They wanted their freedom back. Meanwhile, I sat in my office surrounded by hundreds of pages of evidence, watching a system implode under its own arrogance. Each new piece of information made one thing painfully clear. This wasn't just a story about one abusive HOA. It was about what happens when power operates without accountability, when fear and greed become the foundation of community. Yet, even as the truth came out, one question lingered: how had this gone unnoticed for so long? The answer arrived through a set of internal emails recovered from an archived server. They revealed that the HOA's financial auditor, a firm supposedly independent, had deep ties to Lanning's real estate company. The same firm that signed off on every yearly report had also helped him secure loans for his private developments. They had turned a blind eye to irregularities in exchange for continued business. It wasn't oversight. It was collusion. Karen's role grew clearer too. She had been given full access to homeowner data, addresses, financial information, personal details, and had used it to intimidate residents. One email showed her flagging certain households as uncooperative, prompting the board to target them with additional fines. It was systematic manipulation designed to pressure dissenters into silence or force them to sell their homes. And those homes, once sold, were often bought by companies connected to Lanning's network. It was genius, in a cruel way. The HOA created the fear. The fear drove people out. The empty homes were quietly bought up and resold for profit. Every part of the cycle benefited the same small circle of people. And for years, no one questioned it. By the time law enforcement realized the scope, the financial damage had already spread beyond Willow Creek. Similar patterns were discovered in two nearby communities, both managed by the same regional HOA management firm. It wasn't just one neighborhood. It was a chain, a coordinated operation hidden behind layers of bureaucracy and community standards. When the indictments came, they landed hard. Lanning was charged with fraud and embezzlement. Karen faced charges of harassment, negligence, and unlawful use of authority. The auditing firm was referred for federal investigation. For the first time, the residents of Willow Creek saw the system that had ruled them start to collapse. But justice, even when it arrives, is rarely clean. As the hearings continued, Karen began cooperating with investigators. She turned over documents, recordings, and internal notes. Her cooperation reduced her sentence, but what she revealed was worse than anyone expected. She claimed Lanning had promised her a cut of the profits, a percentage of the administrative fees collected through fines. He had told her to keep residents in line and to make examples of anyone who resisted. She had followed his orders, she said, believing she was helping maintain community order. In a sense, she was both villain and victim, consumed by the very power she thought she controlled. The more I heard, the more personal it felt. Because beneath every rule, every citation, every dollar stolen, were families like my sister's, people who had just wanted a safe neighborhood, who had trusted a system that turned against them. By the end of that month, the county had frozen the HOA's accounts and appointed an interim trustee to manage the cleanup. The residents started the long process of rebuilding, rewriting bylaws, electing a new board, trying to erase years of fear. But some scars never faded. The manicured lawns still looked perfect, but everyone who lived there now saw something different. The peace they once believed in was gone. And yet, one more layer of mystery remained. During the final review of the case files, investigators discovered something unusual: a series of large payments made from the HOA's account to a real estate development firm located 2 counties away. The firm specialized in land acquisition for commercial expansion. It wasn't tied directly to Lanning. It was larger, older, and deeply entrenched in regional politics. It raised a chilling possibility that Willow Creek wasn't the first test of this model, and wouldn't be the last. The case against Lanning and Karen had exposed one level of corruption. But as I looked over those new documents, one thought kept echoing in my mind. If this was just one neighborhood, how many others were quietly running the same way? The question would haunt me long after the trial ended, because the deeper you look into the world of HOAs, the more you realize It's never just about lawns and fences. It's about control, money, and the illusion of order. And someone, somewhere, was still profiting from that illusion. By the time the trial began, Willow Creek was no longer a community. It was a case study in systemic failure. The lawns still gleamed, the houses still stood in perfect symmetry, but the people behind those doors were fractured, cautious, and deeply distrustful. What had once been a neighborhood had become a courtroom exhibit. Every detail of the case had already been dissected by the media. Headlines framed Karen as a symbol of HOA tyranny, while others painted her as a scapegoat for deeper corruption. Lanning, the former HOA president, remained silent under the guidance of his attorneys, issuing no public statements. But his name had become synonymous with greed. And somewhere between their two narratives, the reckless enforcer and the corrupt mastermind, lay the story of an entire system that had thrived on silence. For me, the trial was unlike any I had presided over. The ethical boundaries were razor-thin. Though my personal connection had been disclosed and an oversight panel had approved my continued role for pretrial motions, the public still questioned it. Every glance, every decision, every pause in the proceedings was scrutinized. I wasn't just weighing evidence. I was being watched. The prosecution opened with precision. They outlined the financial fraud, the intimidation, and the deliberate abuse of authority. They showed how HOA dues had been siphoned through shell companies, how residents had been fined into submission, and how Karen's enforcement served as a smokescreen for the theft of community funds. Each exhibit was damning. Each witness added another layer of decay. The defense countered with the same narrative that had already begun circulating online, that Karen had been manipulated. They argued that she was following orders, believing she was upholding community standards. They pointed to her cooperation with investigators as evidence of remorse. For Lanning, the argument was different. His attorneys portrayed him as a businessman overwhelmed by administrative chaos. Not a criminal, but a victim of delegation gone wrong. It was a performance, one that played well to the cameras, but crumbled under the weight of the documents. The prosecution presented financial trails that left little room for doubt. Bank transfers, falsified invoices, private communications, all pointing directly to Lanning's control. One email in particular captured the heart of the case, an instruction from Lanning to Karen, telling her to keep pressure high on households behind on dues. The more fines they collected, the more revenue flowed into his system. It wasn't governance. It was extortion disguised as order. As the evidence built, public reaction turned furious. Residents who had once been afraid to speak now flooded community meetings demanding restitution. Online forums buzzed with outrage, their posts shared thousands of times. What had started as a single neighborhood's scandal became a national conversation about unchecked HOA authority. Lawmakers began referencing Willow Creek as a catalyst for reform. For the first time, people were questioning how much power a homeowners association should have, and who held them accountable. Yet beneath all that attention, the human side of the story was still raw. My niece's injury remained the emotional center of the case. Her name wasn't often spoken aloud in court, but every mention drew silence. The photographs, the medical reports, the testimony, they were reminders of what had set this all in motion. This wasn't just a story of fraud and greed. It was a story of harm, of how the pursuit of control could leave real people broken. As the weeks passed, the trial revealed more than corruption. It exposed the psychology of power. Karen's testimony was perhaps the most striking moment of the entire proceeding. When she took the stand, she looked different, smaller, fragile, stripped of the self-assurance that once defined her. She admitted to everything, the citations, the patrols, the harassment, but her justification was chilling. She said she believed she was keeping order, that she thought the rules mattered more than people, that she had been convinced discipline was the only way to maintain value, It was fanaticism in bureaucratic form, the weaponization of procedure. Lanning never took the stand. His attorneys kept him silent, confident that the complexity of the financial web would create enough confusion to cast doubt. But his silence said more than any words could. The evidence spoke for him, and it was merciless. When closing arguments arrived, the courtroom was packed. Residents filled every seat, reporters lined the aisles, and outside, protesters gathered holding signs demanding reform. The prosecution's final statement was simple. This is what happens when power forgets people. It wasn't theatrical. It didn't need to be. The defense focused on technicalities, arguing over chain of custody, over interpretation of bylaws, over the supposed vagueness of HOA authority. But their words felt hollow. The jury, ordinary citizens who had likely lived under HOAs themselves, understood the deeper truth. They'd seen people like Karen before. They'd paid fines that made no sense. They knew exactly what unchecked control looked like. When the verdict finally came, the silence was absolute. Lanning was found guilty on all counts of fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. His sentencing would come later, but his empire had already collapsed. Karen was convicted on charges of harassment and unlawful enforcement, but received a reduced sentence due to her cooperation. The auditing firm faced fines and sanctions that effectively dismantled its operations. For the residents of Willow Creek, it was vindication, but also exhaustion. They had lived for years under an illusion of order. Now, standing in the wreckage of that illusion, they were free, but uncertain. What would come next? How do you rebuild trust when the system that promised safety became the very thing that destroyed it? After the verdict, I stayed late in chambers. The courthouse had emptied, and the quiet was suffocating. I thought about my niece, about how one afternoon in summer had unraveled an entire network of corruption. She didn't understand the full scope of what had happened, and maybe that was for the best. She only knew that something terrible had occurred, and that the adults around her were trying to make sense of it. Justice had been served, technically, but it didn't feel complete, because beneath every law and every ruling, there are human costs the system can't measure. The lost trust, the lingering fear, the community scarred beyond recognition. The next morning, Willow Creek officially dissolved its homeowners association. The residents voted to replace it with a voluntary neighborhood council. No fines, no patrols, no hierarchies, just people trying to live side by side again. The symbolism was powerful, but the process would take time. The damage wasn't just structural. It was psychological. For weeks, reporters continued to dig. New articles uncovered similar schemes across the state. Smaller, quieter versions of the same abuse. In many of them, the same management companies appeared. Different names, same pattern. The revelation confirmed what I had already suspected. Willow Creek wasn't an anomaly. It was a warning. And as those stories spread, my role as judge began to feel less like closure and more like responsibility. Because the case was over. But the system that allowed it to happen was still out there, replicating itself in communities that looked just as perfect, just as safe. Justice, I realized, wasn't a finish line. It was maintenance. Constant, exhausting, necessary maintenance. When I finally drove past Willow Creek again months later, the gates were gone. The signs had been removed, and the clubhouse stood empty. Grass grew wild where everything had once been precise. The perfection was gone, and for the first time, that felt like a good thing. But even as I looked at that broken order, one question still lingered in my mind. If this was what happened when power went unchecked in one neighborhood, what might still be hidden in the ones no one was looking at? By the time the dust settled, Willow Creek was unrecognizable. Not physically, but socially and emotionally. The lawns remained manicured, the houses unchanged, yet everything else had shifted. The air was no longer thick with fear. and the once omnipresent sense of scrutiny that Karen had imposed had vanished. In its place was a cautious relief, a community grappling with the scars of years spent under an unchallenged authority. The legal repercussions were only the beginning. Lanning faced a lengthy prison sentence for embezzlement and fraud, his financial empire dismantled by audits and federal oversight. Karen's sentencing was lighter due to her cooperation, but it was still significant, accompanied by community service, probation, and restrictions on holding any HOA positions in the future. The auditing firm that had signed off on the inflated financials received fines and a permanent revocation of their license. Justice, in the literal sense, had been served. Yet the deeper victory was symbolic. Willow Creek residents reclaimed their autonomy. The HOA was formally dissolved and replaced with a voluntary neighborhood council, stripped of authority to fine, regulate, or patrol. The new system was minimalistic. A simple board to organize block parties, coordinate maintenance, and mediate disputes, designed specifically to prevent a repeat of the previous abuses. For the first time in years, residents didn't feel watched. They felt free. Even so, the psychological impact lingered. Many longtime residents remained wary, hesitant to trust new leadership. Some had sold their homes and moved away entirely, unwilling to continue living in a place that had, for years, been a mechanism for fear. The younger generation, like my niece Lily, had to navigate a complex mix of relief, trauma, and lingering distrust. Though her physical injuries had healed, the emotional imprint of that summer remained. Every knock at the door, every letter from a neighbor, carried the weight of the past. Outside the immediate community, Willow Creek became a cautionary tale. News outlets and social media platforms chronicled the rise and fall of Karen's reign, drawing attention to the broader issue of HOA overreach. Lawmakers referenced the case when debating new regulations for homeowners associations. Civic watchdog groups cited it as an example of the need for transparency, accountability, and independent auditing. For a short time, Willow Creek became synonymous with reform, the HOA horror story that demanded attention nationwide. But even as reform progressed, I knew the deeper problems were systemic. Willow Creek had been one neighborhood, but the patterns, obsessive enforcement, selective intimidation, financial exploitation, existed elsewhere. The HOA system, in itself, was neutral. It was the human element, the combination of unchecked authority and greed, that created a danger. My role as judge had been to mediate one small instance, to ensure accountability where it was possible. But I also understood that vigilance beyond the courtroom was necessary. Systems fail only when people fail to act. In my chambers, I reflected on the moral complexities of the case. Karen had been both a perpetrator and a product of the system. Lanning had been manipulative and selfish, but he operated within a structure that enabled his ambition. The residents were victims, but they were also enablers in small ways. Complacent, intimidated, or simply unaware of the magnitude of control. Justice in Willow Creek was not just about punishment. It was about exposing the network of complicity that allowed corruption to flourish. The trial also underscored the human cost of institutionalized control. Families like my sister's, once hopeful and trusting, had been subjected to a slow, persistent erosion of autonomy. Children like Lily had experienced trauma not through direct malice alone, but through the indirect consequences of fear, intimidation, and negligence. The case reminded me that harm is rarely isolated. It ripples, affecting those who are least able to defend themselves. Months later, Willow Creek began hosting community forums, workshops, and educational sessions on civic engagement. The goal was simple: prevent the rise of another Karen or Lanning. Residents shared experiences, discussed reform strategies, and rebuilt networks of trust. Slowly, life returned to something resembling normalcy. Yet the lessons remained visible in small, deliberate changes: transparent financial reporting, resident oversight, and clear guidelines for authority. The community had learned, the hard way, that perfection on the surface could mask profound dysfunction underneath. Personally, the case left a permanent mark. Presiding over proceedings involving a family member blurred the line between professional duty and personal loyalty. I had to remain impartial while carrying an emotional weight that few judges ever encounter. Balancing justice and empathy became a daily exercise in restraint. The experience reminded me why the law exists, not to eliminate human emotion, but to structure it in ways that prevent abuse, restore accountability, and protect those most vulnerable. As for Karen, her name faded from daily conversation but never entirely disappeared. She became an emblem of what happens when obsession meets opportunity. Lanning's influence evaporated, yet the mechanisms he exploited remained possible in countless other communities. Willow Creek's story served as a warning. Vigilance must be constant, transparency uncompromised, and residents empowered to speak without fear. For my niece, life slowly returned to a new normal. She biked again, sketched again, and discovered resilience she hadn't realized she possessed. Her parents remained vigilant, but they also witnessed firsthand the power of advocacy, legal recourse, and community solidarity. Lily's experience, tragic as it had been, catalyzed meaningful change, both in Willow Creek and in my own understanding of justice. In the end, the case was a reminder of human complexity. No one was purely evil, and no system is immune to failure. But when fear, greed, and authority converge, the results can be catastrophic. Willow Creek had survived because enough people refused to look the other way, because accountability eventually caught up with those who had misused power. As I drove away from the neighborhood one final time, I felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. The gates were gone, the HOA disbanded, and the lawns were quietly tending themselves. Yet the questions remained. How many other communities were quietly operating under the same pressures? How many children, neighbors, and families were silently affected by similar abuses? The answers were unknowable, but the lesson was clear. Oversight, transparency, and courage are essential, even in the most seemingly perfect places. Willow Creek was no longer perfect, but perhaps, finally, it was free. And that, more than anything else, was the story I would carry. The story of control, abuse, justice, and the long, difficult path to rebuilding trust.